Hello, my name is Sister Elizabeth Polyev. I'm a faithful companion of Jesus living in Edmonton, Canada. The topic for this workshop is Culture of Vocation, presented by Father Edmund Lo, S.J. What kind of culture fosters vocations? Does such a culture exist? In this workshop, Father Edmund will highlight several aspects of such a culture by gleaning from some of Pope Francis's papal writings, with a specific focus on accompaniment and discernment. Father Edmund immigrated from Hong Kong to Canada with his family when he was a teenager. He obtained an MSc in neuroscience and worked as a bioethics research intern before joining the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, in 2008. He was ordained a priest in 2018 and obtained his licentiate in sacred theology from Regis College in Toronto, Canada. He is the interim vocation director of the Jesuits in Canada, as well as the assistant to the novice master in the Canadian Jesuit novitiate. Over to you now.
Hi, we are all doing vocation work to a certain extent, and I have been asked to speak about a culture of vocations. Now, the question for us is, does a culture of vocation exist, or should we change the way we ask this question? First of all, what exactly are we referring to when we talk about a culture of vocations? Are we referring to the good old days when there are big classes of postulants and novices, when a religious vocation seems to be less of a niche thing? Was there a culture of vocations back then? Or what kind of culture of vocations was there? To me, this is more of a sociological question, and people have already dabbled into it. But I like to think that we are not trending towards a direction that, oh, the good old days were perfect. Let us all find a way to replicate what we had done in the past or get into a time machine. Or um, are we referring to ensuring that there's an idea of becoming a religious, be it priest, brother, or sister, that, oh, this isn't such a foreign idea? Well, if this is the case, then we simply need to hire a public relations firm and have very slick looking websites. Yet, I don't think this is what we have in mind either. And secondly, we need to clarify what we mean by vocations, lest we disagree or fight over ideas and approaches without even a lowest common denominator. Now, there's this famous quote from the Presbyterian Frederick Wecker on vocations that has been batted around, and perhaps many of you may be fond of it yourself. Now, that quote says, "Your vocation in life is where your greatest joy meets the world's greatest need." There is truth to that. But also, I think there is a need to better flesh out the unspoken presumptions here. For instance, well, not only does God speak through our greatest joys, God is our greatest joy. And encountering and being transformed by our Lord Jesus Christ is an irreplaceable component. Or the world's greatest need speaks to us and moves us beyond a strictly humanistic level. But because we serve Jesus Christ in those situations, as he says in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew, "Whatever you do to the least of your brethren, you do it to me." And so, in short, in order for our discussion and reflection on the culture of vocations, or vocations in general, to have any traction, we need to acknowledge that, well, God is the most central part of it. Or else we can simply have our conversations remain on a humanistic or sociological level, but we somehow leave God out of it, or have God somehow vaguely float in the background. We may well disagree on this very crucial point, and that's fine, but I am not the one who originates this theological perspective. Pope Francis himself, he's a strong proponent of this viewpoint as well, that the encounter with God through Jesus Christ is the most central component in our Christian life, and especially so when we speak of vocations. And, well, he isn't the one who comes up with this stance either. As we know, the root of the word vocation can be traced back to its Latin root vocare, which means to call. We are called by someone, called by a person, and we respond to a person. Now, while we can certainly take a more, say, metaphorical or poetic interpretation to it and exclude this person, well, we need to consider this personal aspect as central to our Christian context, because God, whom we Christians worship, is neither an idea nor an energy force. We are called by God who loves us with an everlasting love, who has shown himself to us through our Lord Jesus Christ, and who has called us to follow him, something which we understand as Christian discipleship. Now, all of this requires that we learn to hear the voice of God and to listen to his voice. We strive to hear the voice of God in a heart that is restless, and a healthy kind of restlessness at that. It is exactly as St. Augustine says, "You have created us for yourself, Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." And as Pope Francis says in Christus Vivit, that post-synodal exhortation to the young people, he says that restless discontent combined with exhilaration before the opening up of new horizons generates a boldness that leads you to stand up and take responsibility for a mission. This deeply personal aspect of our encounter with God is, I would say, pithily summarized by Pope Francis in the same document. When we speak of vocations and our journeying with young people, we can begin with the question, who am I? And there is a lot of value to that. Who am I? What are my gifts and talents? What are my strengths and weaknesses? What is my place in the world? These are all important questions. But Pope Francis says the trap here is to simply remain on the level of who am I? And, we'll continue to make this introspective turn and warp this understanding of vocation with an unhealthy twist of self-centeredness. And this is where Pope Francis challenges us. How does he challenge us? He says that we need to move from the question, who am I, to for whom am I? So to move from the question, who am I, to for whom am I? We know the answer to this question already. Well, for whom am I? It is Jesus Christ. There can't be anyone else. It is the centrality of Christ. And some of us may find this to be too pious or churchy. But regardless, it speaks to the central character of religious life. Perhaps in the years past, we could say that religious were known to do this or that, say as a profession. These were teachers, nurses, social workers. They were known to serve in this or that way. we identify them by what they do. But nowadays, whatever they were doing, say 70 or 100 years ago, we can do them without giving up personal wealth, the warmth of having our own family, or having to answer to someone else through obedience. If I can do all these things already, well, why do I want to give up all of these things? Now, there needs to be something more profound, or someone more. And this is the insight of Pope Francis's statement, "For whom am I?" So our lives are for God because God is totally and unreservedly for me. As we hear from St. Paul as he writes his letter to the Galatians, as he says, "And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." Now, of course, Pope Francis, he sees this "for whom am I" in a very holistic way. We are for God, but God has also decided that we should be for others, to share the gifts that He has given us with others. In other words, our lives are one of service to others. And this, I propose, is the central question for us if we are to entertain the idea of a culture of vocations. The question is, how do we help young people to go deeper into this question of "for whom am I?" What kind of things can we do, and what kinds of dispositions do we need to have or cultivate to allow this question to service? Perhaps we can ask ourselves this question as well for our own respective religious orders and congregations. Let's also go from "who are we" to "for whom are we?" Big questions. Now, we can talk about a central theme that Pope Francis has constantly mentioned when he's discussing our ministering to young people. It is the need to learn how to discern. After all, he is a Jesuit, so this is unsurprising. The need to learn how to discern. It is quite significant that he speaks and writes about discernment so often as the Pope. Now we can interpret it this way, that Pope Francis, he is offering the Jesuits' way of discernment as a gift to the Church, making it available to everyone, that discernment is not seen as a niche practice in which only Jesuits engage, or of which only Jesuits are capable. Now, I find his explanation on discernment the most insightful in the apostolic exhortation "Gaudete et Exsultate" on the call to holiness in today's world. Here we find a coherence in his thoughts, and his comments coalesce with what I have just mentioned with the "for whom am I?" He is so clear about it that I will just quote him directly. And this is from "Gaudete et Exsultate" paragraphs 174 and 175. Discernment is not about discovering what more can we get out of this life, but about recognizing how we can better accomplish the mission entrusted to us at our baptism. So I'll repeat, discernment is not about discovering what more can we get out of this life, but about recognizing how we can better accomplish the mission entrusted to us at our baptism. He continues, this entails a readiness to make sacrifices, even to sacrificing everything. And Pope Francis continues, for happiness is a paradox. We experiencing it most when we accept the mysterious logic that is not of this world. This is our logic, says St. Bonaventure, pointing to the cross. Once we enter into this dynamic, we will not let our consciences be numbed, and we will open ourselves generously to discernment. Again, this is from Gaudete et Exsultate, paragraphs 174 to 175. In light of this, we can even venture to say that cultivating discerning hearts is crucial to the building and fostering of a culture of vocations. This understanding of discernment directly challenges and debunks several implicit but false ideas that sometimes we ourselves, maybe even subconsciously, taking for granted. First of all, the modern zero sum notion that either God wins or I win. If God is happy, then I am not happy. Nor is this a typical win win situation, as if God and I are simply contractual parties on equal footing. Rather, the fulfillment of the deepest human desires is on a supernatural level. And this comes straight out of the script of the Second Vatican Council, very much influenced by the thoughts of the Jesuit theologian Henri de Lubac. We approach and grow into our fullest selves when we follow the mysterious but always loving plan that God has for us. When we begin to become more and more like His Son, Jesus Christ. In a sense, Pope Francis, he is simply playing the best hits here. Without turning this into a full-blown discernment of spirit seminar, which we can do, but it would be for another time, I'll mention a few points that Pope Francis touches upon. He says that discernment is very concrete. And if we find that the way we are discerning seems very abstract, well, then we are not really discerning. Discernment most definitely includes the concrete means that God provides in His providential plan for us. When discerning, we aren't simply posing the big questions. As Pope Francis says, often discernment is exercised in small and apparently irrelevant things. Since greatness of spirit is manifested in simple everyday realities. Discern the big stuff through the small stuff. That's how I'll put it. Collect the smaller pieces of data to see what kind of bigger picture emerge. This also challenges us to develop a discerning disposition to hone a daily awareness to how the Spirit of God moves in our lives. And Pope Francis also say that discernment does not exclude, discernment does not exclude human matters. Human matters, and he calls them the existential things, psychological, sociological, and moral matters. Discernment does not exclude them, but it also transcends them. Reason and prudence need to be exercised, but discernment goes beyond them. Because he says discernment has to do with the meaning of my life before the Father who knows me and loves me, with the real purpose of my life which nobody knows better than He. So let us summarize the importance of discernment with the words of Pope Francis again, from Gaudete et Exsultate. When in God's presence we examine our life's journey, no areas can be off limits. In all aspects of life, we can continue to grow and offer something greater to God, even in those areas we find most difficult. God asks everything of us, yet He also gives everything to us. Discernment, then, is not a solipsistic self analysis or a form of egoistical introspection, but an authentic process of leaving ourselves behind in order to approach the mystery of God, who helps us to carry out the mission to which He has called us for the good of our brothers and sisters. Needless to say, we ourselves need to cultivate a discerning disposition if we are to help young people cultivate discerning hearts themselves. Now, by this very act of helping young people in this very specific way, Pope Francis calls it accompaniment. When we accompany young people on their journey, and especially on their way of discerning God's will for them, we are helping them to better listen to God, how the Lord speaks through others, and how the Lord speaks through reality itself. And so, this aspect of listening is absolutely essential. First of all, we live in the age of information overload. The availability of information on our fingertips can be very convenient to our daily living. But this does not directly lead to an ability to sift through information and make correct judgments in light of them. In other words, we need to be on constant alert of being drowned in too much information and too quickly, and being pressured to make hasty decisions. Not all information is helpful. Pope Francis describes this phenomenon as a great distraction, a kind of restlessness that just wants action. We can become prey to every passing trend, every novel thing that comes our way without the wisdom of discernment. This is something that I'll briefly touch upon later on. But secondly, we can only know what comes from the Holy Spirit and what comes from the spirit of the world through discernment. We can describe this as a kind of intent listening on a different level that goes beyond common sense to examine what we are receiving and what is within us, so as to better recognize the paths that leads to a greater freedom to love and to serve. But let us zoom out a little bit. We can discuss what programs to organize and what books to read until the end of time. We really can. We can do all these things to influence the environment around young people, and we may fancy ourselves as being able to change our culture in some way. But all our efforts shall be all for naught if young people do not know who God is, or how to listen to this voice, or how to discern through all the tugs and pulls in their hearts. All of these require listening. For our parts as religious, when we accompany young people, Pope Francis says in Christus Vivit that we need to have three specific kinds of sensitivity. So this is from Christus Vivit, paragraphs 292 to 294. Three specific kinds of sensitivity. First, a sensitivity to a young person as a person, something that Jesuits would call cura personalis, the care for the person on every level. In other words, the young person is neither a case file, nor a problem to be solved, even less someone to be persuaded with a kind of business interests. Now, this way I would describe this kind of listening is that, well, my time is their time. Think about it. My time is their time as I listen to them. Let them talk freely. Your time isn't necessarily more precious than theirs because we all operate in God's time. And second, a sensitivity to the discernment of spirits. Again, this comes straight out of the Jesuit playbook. What are the graces to be found? Where are they to be found in this person's life? Where is the temptation popping up? Which spirit is at work? And in light of all these, what kind of action ought to be taken or not to be taken? Third, a sensitivity to perceive the young person's drive and motivation and the directionality that lies underneath. This goes beyond mere likes and feelings, but this points towards what Pope Francis calls the ultimate intention of the heart. The ultimate intention of the heart. And finally, let us not forget the importance of prayer. Pope Francis says, well, God speaks to us at every moment, that is for sure, but silence and prayer are absolutely necessary. We can also talk about that examine prayer to identify the consolations and desolations of our day. That can also be very helpful. Now, let me summarize this section with another quote from Christus Vivit. This one is from Christus Vivit, paragraph 277. Jesus is walking in our midst, as he did in Galilee. He walks through our streets, and he quietly stops and looks into our eyes. His call is attractive and intriguing. Yet today, the stress and quick pace of a world constantly bombarding us with stimuli can leave no room for that interior silence which we can perceive Jesus' gaze and hear his call. In the meantime, many attractively packaged offers will come your way. They may seem appealing and exciting, although in time they will only leave you feeling empty, weary, and alone. Don't let this happen to you, because the maelstrom of this world can drive you to take a route without real meaning, without direction, without clear goals, and thus thwart many of your efforts. It is better to seek out that calm and quiet that enable you to reflect, pray, and look more clearly at the world around you. And then with Jesus, come to recognize the vocation that is yours in this world. And now I'd like to briefly mention one particular noise that Pope Francis has brought up in his writings, a noise that can distort our effort to listen. This noise, Pope Francis calls ideology. Now, here, Pope Francis, he isn't simply referring to our often politically charged understanding of ideologies. He goes beyond politics here to the level of the heart. So, what we're not trying to do here is, well, if young people are into Eucharistic adoration and prefer reverent liturgies, then they must be conservative far-right Catholics. Or say, if young people are socially active and are into serving and caring for others on a more systemic level, then they must be communists in disguise as Catholics. That is not where we are going. Pope Francis, he talks about ideologies in an interesting way in chapter 6 of Christus Vivit, in which he speaks of the importance of young people to have roots, to be rooted in something. So, the importance of young people to have roots, to be rooted in something. Pope Francis says that fostering intergenerational relationships, such as that between grandparents and grandchildren, old people and young people, this is very important in his eyes in order to remain rooted. More importantly, he identifies buying into ideologies as being without roots. Buying into ideologies as being without roots. He says that this is how various ideologies operate. They destroy or deconstruct all differences so that they can reign unopposed. To do so, however, they need young people to have no use for history, who spurn their spiritual and human riches inherited from past generations and are ignorant of everything that comes before them. Now, this is very poignant, I would say, to disconnect ourselves with whatever that are associated with past generations, to be ignorant to everything that came before them. So out with the old, in with the new, because what is old is passé. It is guilty of this and that capital sin, and is no longer worth considering under any shape or form. Perhaps what we now call cancel culture is one kind of manifestation of this. Roots, according to Pope Francis, they are not anchors chaining us to past times and preventing us from facing the present and creating something new. Instead, he says they are a fixed point from which we can grow and meet new challenges. While it goes without saying, once again, that we need to help young people to not get sucked into ideologies, it needs to be said too that we ourselves need to be hyper vigilant about our own buying into any ideologies or meta narratives that risk erasing roots. We are not going to be helpful in leading young people out of the woods of ideologies if we ourselves are unknowingly being led by the nose. Now, in another example, in this sixth chapter of Christus Vivit, Pope Francis, he talks about the cult of youth, or perhaps we can reword it to the ideology of youth and beauty. Here, he is talking about a kind of idolizing of youth, clinging onto a kind of superficial beauty as if it is the real thing. Pope Francis, he combats this ideology of superficial beauty and youth with, I would say, a thoroughly Christian view of beauty, which traces the source of beauty back to the beauty of the cross, the beauty of the ecce homo. That's another example of ideology and how we can combat ideology. If by vocation we mean that God loves us and calls us to respond to Him in love, then helping to untangle them and helping ourselves to untangle them from ideology will help young people to better listen to the voice of God and follow His path, lest they be guided by the voice of ideologies as the ultimate truth and follow down a path of idolatry. Now, I've talked for a little while now, but what else can we do? What else can we do in light of this culture of vocations to how to foster it. I think it goes without saying that the absolute very least that we can do is that we need to be in contact with young people on a personal level. And here we're not talking about simply on a corporate level or tangentially through social media. I like to say that, well, what else can we do? First of all, let us also beware of what I would call sneaky faulty logic. Beware of sneaky faulty logic. What do I mean by that? For example, I'll mention one sneaky faulty logic. If we build the culture of vocations right, if we do it well, then the numbers will speak for itself. So where is the faulty logic here? The faulty logic is that numbers are reliable criteria of a culture of vocations. Because if we want to talk about, oh, numbers will speak for itself, what kind of numbers are we talking about? Are we talking about what one would call raw numbers? How many vocations we are getting every year? But in comparison to whom? Or to the numbers from how many years ago? And why do we choose to compare our numbers this way, or with this group or that group, with this time period or that time period? How valid are these comparisons? These are all legitimate questions on the methodology. And we can do a lot better than to simply say that, well, because it makes sense, or, well, you've got to do something, right? So, this equal sign that we are tempted to draw between building a culture of vocations and the increase in numbers, especially for my congregation, that is a huge logical leap. We may wish that it were so, but there is nothing self evident about it. One thing does not necessarily lead to another. Another thing that I would say is that we can do litmus tests. Litmus tests. Tests to what? To our own interior freedom. What do I mean by that? Let's have some examples. For instance, if you're from a female religious congregation, someone has approached you, you've known this person for a while, and they're very active in whatever programming that you put out. And one day she comes to you and you think that, oh, she is interested in my religious congregation. Good, I've got my package already. I've got my sales pitch all ready to go. But, this lady comes to you and says, well, I feel called to become a consecrated virgin. And, well, lots of things can come to our mind. First of all, like, who? What? What are you talking about? Or, wait, isn't that like from like 1,500 years ago? We don't have that anymore. Or perhaps the thought could be, well, why not join us? Another example would be, say, for those of you who are from male religious orders, young men, discerning his vocation with your religious order for a while. Things are warming up, seems optimistic, and then he decides to switch tracks to discern with another religious order. So these are the kind of litmus tests that I am talking about, the tests of our own interior freedom. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that all these things, it speaks less to a kind of a recruitment mentality, a kind of fishing in the same pond mentality. Actually, there's competition going on. Oh, how do I get a young man or woman to be interested in my congregation? Rather, this speaks more to the mentality of, well, how do we ensure that there is healthy ecosystem in the pond so that, in a sense, everyone can fish in there? How do I help to foster an environment, a worldview, a kind of inner disposition through which young men and women would want to do God's will for them in serving others through religious life? And also, I think this speaks to this reality of realizing and accepting that at times it means that others are getting the fish, but I do not. In other words, it challenges us to become less provincial or territorial, less worries about the, dare I say, survival of one's group, one's congregation, but more concerned on the bigger picture, on the health of the church in general. Finally, I think this cannot be understated. Be a happy religious. That witness itself is attractive. We are not talking about simply being Canadian, always carrying a polite smile on our faces. Rather, it is a joy that radiates from within. It's almost like you cannot help but to radiate that joy. That from the reality that there is a joy and peace that comes with answering God's call, especially through all the hardships and challenges in religious life. It is a testament that this life of service, this life of a gift of self is worth living. It is to realize that we, as religious, we're more than just the ones in the background who foster a culture of vocations. We are an integral part of it. So let us not somehow extract ourselves and our vocations from the picture. It is my sincere hope that this presentation has given you something to ponder about, to open rather than close doors in our reflection on how to foster a culture of vocations today. May God bless you today.
Thank you, Father Edmund, for this informative and helpful presentation on how to foster a culture of vocation. That's it for this session. Please enjoy the rest of the conference.